Hey, what's going on, everybody? I hope you're all well and your families are good, you're washing your hands, and you've been diving into your schoolwork this week. So I wanted to reach out to you guys with a couple attempts at lecturing a little bit to you, so we could do a couple lessons this way. I don't know how many of these I'll do, but I'll give it a shot. But I figured I'd start with this one. So let me start the way I would start if we were all together in the classroom here, starting the first day of the Civil War. And the way I would start is to share with you a strange and fascinating fact from the Civil War. I like to do that with every day that we would be studying the war, because there are so many strange and fascinating things about the Civil War. It's one of the fun things about studying it. A lot of the things that I would share with you come out of a book that is, believe it or not, entitled The Civil War, Strange and Fascinating Facts. A friend gave this to me a long time ago, and I've been using it ever since. At some point, if you ever want to borrow this from me or look it up, it's a cool book because it is not a novel. It's not like a long story that you got to sit down and read the whole thing. It's a bunch of short little stories about the war. Some that you could sit down in one sitting for 5 or 10 minutes, or only 1 or 2 pages. In fact, the one I'm going to share with you today is just like that. It's only 2 pages. And I have a photocopy of it, but that's one of the ones I got out of this book, and it is titled Mr. Lincoln's Beard. It's the story of President Lincoln's beard. Has anyone here ever heard that story? Do you know why he has the beard that we're all so familiar with? Well, I'm going to tell you if you don't. So I'm just going to read this one because it's short. It says, Lincoln was the 16th American president and the first to wear a beard. He set so enduring a precedent that, of the next 9 men elected to the office after him, only William McKinley was clean-shaven. The presidential candidate had apparently never given a thought to growing whiskers until about October 18th, 1860. He had a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell from Westfield, New York, proposing that he give up shaving. And she wrote, I have got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway, and if you will let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. That's the cutest thing ever. Lincoln replied to her the next day, As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a piece of silly affectation if I were to begin it now? Within a very few weeks, Lincoln appeared unshaven, and stubble sprouted from his long chin. On November 26th, he had his first bearded photograph made, a thin, straggling line of dark hair along his jaws. On January 26th, when he sat for his next photograph, the beard was still straggly. And only by February 9th, just before he left Springfield, Illinois for Washington, D.C., had his beard grown into the familiar appendage on the most famous face in American history. Lincoln's route from Illinois to Washington was long and torturous. He was 2 weeks on the way, halting at whistle stops to be seen by curious people who stared at him as a symbol of a new, strange, and dangerous time, the beginning of the Civil War. One of the stops was at Westfield, New York, and here Lincoln paused in the middle of his speech. During my campaign, I had a little correspondent from your town. She kindly admonished me to let my whiskers grow, and since I have taken her advice, I would like to see her. Is she here? Is Grace Bedell here? A little girl was handed up through the crowd, and Lincoln kissed her while people applauded. Busy newspaper correspondents hurried the story away before the train even left the station. Lincoln did not please all who saw him in his new guise. Not long after, when the president was inaugurated in Washington, D.C., his former law partner, William H. Herndon, kept a bright-eyed watch and said this. He was raising a crop of whiskers of the blackening brush variety, coarse, stiff, and ungraceful. And in so doing, he spoiled a face which, though never very handsome, had in its original state a peculiar power and pathos. So I guess not everybody liked his beard, but what's the lesson here? Anyone? All the ladies like whiskers, is that it? No, it's grow a beard and you'll become the president, I guess. That's what happens. At least that's what happened for Lincoln. So there you go. If you never heard that story, That's how Lincoln chose to grow that beard. And of course, all of the pictures we ever see of Lincoln, we have him in that beard, but that's because nobody knew who he was before he became the president. All the years of his life that he didn't have the beard, but we get to see him with the beard. All right, so there you go. That's strange and fascinating fact number one, Mr. Lincoln's beard. And if I do more of these along the way, or even with assignments that I'm going to post on Schoology, maybe you'll get a few more strange and fascinating facts. Okay, so I always like to start with that, and I also like to start the first day of the Civil War chapter talking about a battle. Right? I go right into the war and into the battle just to get you guys excited and interested. This is going to be a little bit different than if we were all here together because I'm just going to pick a few random lessons that I might want to do these little videos for just to see you guys and have you see me and talk a little bit. So it's going to seem a little bit disconnected. It might not seem like it flows like it normally does because every day we come in, we hear the next part of the story. But we're not going to be able to do it that way. So you have the readings I'm going to be giving you. You have the, you should have already at this point copied at least this much of the notes that I posted. And so I'll be able to go through these quickly. You don't have to keep up with me because you should have the notes in front of you. If you don't, get out your notes that you've copied down. And we're just going to go over the very first famous battle of the Civil War. I'll give you a second to do that. Oh, actually, you can pause the video anytime you need to. So let's just get right to it. So we labeled our notes section 1, the first 2 years of the war. You already should be reading about that in the first section of the book. And one of the things that you should have read about or will read about is the first battle of Manassas. So I'm just going to take about 5 minutes here and I'm going to cover the basics of this battle so you have an understanding of it.
Go back that way.
Getting a little glare? Is that better?
Yeah.
I got Mrs. Weibel working the camera right now. She loves listening to these lectures. Say,
Hi, kids.
Here she is. All right, so good. She's going to be our director for these. So if they're bad, we're going to blame her. Okay, so when the war began, of course, last chapter we had the Battle of Fort Sumter. We had the first shots fired, and the war commenced. The first reaction that people had was to fight a battle, end this thing, and let's move on with our lives and get our country back together. And so that's how we have this very first, what's called the First Battle of Manassas. Now I have two names up there, Manassas and Bull Run. It's the only battle that I'm going to give you two names for, but most of the major engagements in the war do have two names, and that's kind of a strange and fascinating fact too, because both the North and the South named the battles different things. The North always named their battles after the some sort of geographic feature that was prevalent where the battle was, like a mountain or a river or a stream or a hill or something like that. The South always named their battles after the nearest city or town. So the Battle of First Manassas, that's the southern name for this. It takes place in a town called Manassas Junction in Virginia. Bull Run was a creek that runs through the middle of this battlefield, and so it also gets that name from the northern side, the Battle of Bull Run. Don't worry about knowing two names for every battle. I just like to introduce you to this first one that way. All right, so let's talk about the Battle of First Manassas. Anyone want to guess why I call it the First Battle of Manassas? Yeah, there's going to be another one. We'll get to that later. You'll be reading about it in your book. So we're going to talk about the First Battle of Manassas. Before we get to the actual fighting, one of the things that you guys had to do was label the capital city of the Confederacy on your map. So you all should have remembered that when the Confederacy was formed, they decided to make Richmond, Virginia their capital. The crazy thing about that is that Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, is only about 100 miles south of Washington, D.C., the northern capital. And so a lot of the fighting is going to take place in a very small area between those two capitals, including this very first battle. So what happens is this. Because there's all this pressure to get the war done, is this okay? Good?
Yeah, I can't see you. Is that okay?
That's all right. Yeah, they don't need to see me. Because there was so much pressure to end this thing and figure it out and move on as a country, the Union amassed this massive force in Washington, and they said, we're just heading towards Richmond, we're going to attack their capital, we're going to take it over, we're going to win the war right now. This untrained, unprepared, a lot of new volunteers, people that had never served, people that didn't have any experience in combat, hadn't been trained, these Union soldiers start marching southward towards Richmond, Virginia. Well, the Confederates aren't just going to allow them to march right into their capital, and so a Confederate army marches northward to stop this Union attack. They meet at Manassas Junction, and that's where we have the first Battle of Manassas. I'm going to just highlight a few of the most important things about the battle, and what I'm going to tell you is this. The initial engagement that occurred in the early hours of the battle, the Union had the upper hand. The Union seemed to be winning the battle. It seemed like they were going to be victorious and maybe even march right into Richmond, and who knows, end the war by taking over the Confederate capital. However, the Confederate forces were able to hold off the Union long enough for reinforcements to make it to the battlefield. And one cool thing about those reinforcements is that the reason the Confederates were able to get their reinforcements there so quickly was because they used railroads. This is the first time ever in human history that railroads were used as a weapon in war. So that's kind of a strange and fascinating fact as well. Once the Confederates were able to get their reinforcements to the front lines, they were able to completely turn the tide of the battle. Once that happened, everything that had been going in the Union's favor turned and started to go into the Confederates' favor, and a lot of that had also to do with one Confederate leader who made a name for himself at this battle, and after that becomes sort of one of the key figures in their army throughout the rest of the war, and that is a dude named Stonewall Jackson. His name is Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and he gets the nickname Stonewall Jackson at this battle. Because at some point before the reinforcements arrived, it looked as though the Confederates were going to have to retreat and the Union was going to overrun them. But this leader, as they said, those who were there, stood like a stone wall, rallied his men to hold their position and hold on long enough for the reinforcements to come. And from then on, he becomes known as Stonewall Jackson. We'll talk and read more about him as we go through the war. Once Stonewall Jackson held the position, the reinforcements showed up for the Confederates and they turned the tide of the battle. They routed the Union forces. The Union was retreating in chaos. They were fleeing back north. And a lot of people believe that if the Confederate army wasn't so inexperienced, just like the Union army was, this was the first battle of this new war, a lot of historians believe that the Confederates may have very well been able to chase the Union north right into Washington, D.C., taken over the Union capital, and who knows what would have happened. The war could have turned out a lot different. But that didn't happen. Once the Union retreated north, the Confederate army held the position and did not advance on them into Washington, D.C. The end result is that this first engagement in the war is a big Confederate victory. I put at the bottom here some casualties. You'll never have to remember those numbers or whatever, but as we go through battles and you read about battles, you will see the numbers. Because while you don't need to remember that 4,700 people died in this battle, there's a reason I put the numbers up there. It's because I want you to have some understanding of how awful this war will end up being whenever we're starting to talk about 5,000 Americans dying on that day of fighting at Manassas. And we'll talk more about that later as well. Okay, the last thing that I want to go over with this little lecture is one more strange and fascinating fact. Strange and fascinating fact number 2 for the day, and that is that last bullet point. It talks about the civilians. And there's number 1 is just strange and fascinating, but there's a reason why I share this with you as well. The civilians in and around the Washington, D.C. area, once the Union Army started moving southward, decided, hey, there's going to be this epic, famous battle. We want to go watch this thing and be a part of history. And so they loaded up their wagons, they got their kids dressed up, they made up their picnic baskets, they loaded up the families, and they literally followed the Union Army southward. And when the two armies engaged at Manassas on the battlefield, the civilians gathered on the hillsides a mile or 2 away surrounding the battlefield and literally watched the battle unfold. So they were up on the hillsides behind the Union Army watching down onto the battlefield while they were fighting. But what did we say happened halfway through this battle? What happened to the Union Army? Once the reinforcements showed up for the Confederates, the Union retreated. As the Union started to retreat off the battlefield and sort of running away in chaos, guess who was right behind them? It was all of these civilians with their families and their kids and their wives and their husbands that had come out to watch. And so it's sort of like these civilians are watching it like, ooh, the explosions are way over there, and look at the smoke in the sky and how loud it is. It's kind of exciting. And then it's like, ooh, wow, those explosions are getting louder. ooh, are they getting close? And then all of a sudden, it was like they were being overrun by the Union Army retreating. Bullets were whizzing past their heads. Cannonballs were exploding near them. They were grabbing their kids, throwing them into the wagons, and trying to get out of there. And so, as far as I know, no civilians were killed when this happened. They were able to retreat with the Union and get away safely. But it was an interesting piece of this story because these civilians, who had all come to see what they thought was going to be this great epic battle, where history is going to be made, they got to see there was a little bit more than boys going off to war to win medals and come back as heroes. What they learned was that this was going to be awful. They saw the explosions and the bullets and the blood and the guts and the death and the destruction firsthand. And so for those few civilians that were there, they had an eye-opening experience on this first Battle of Manassas. A lot like our whole country did. You can stop there.